The 1960s arguably represented the peak of American automotive styling, inside and out. Cars were beautiful, the sheet metal was sculptural, and the interiors had just beautiful detailing. And, well, let's just say that latter part stands in stark contrast to many interiors today that are comprised of myriad pieces of solidified lava, plastic lava, that is. But back in the 1960s, your car looked fabulous, and on the inside, it just felt rich, at least many vehicles at the time, not all. What we're going to discuss today is one vehicle that I think had one of the best interiors ever put in an American car, maybe even of any car. And that is the interior that was inside the 1964 to 1966 Ford Thunderbirds, the so-called Flair birds. Now, before we discuss the interior of the Flair bird, let's talk a little bit about the Thunderbird history and how this 1964 to 1966 Flair bird kind of slots in to Thunderbird history. Now, you have to remember that the Thunderbird wasn't all that popular when it was first introduced, and the first model years, more specifically 1955, 6, and 7, were the two-place Thunderbirds that were sportier vehicles meant to compete with the Chevrolet Corvette, for example. And while they certainly were good lookers of the time, they just didn't sell all that well. The real revolution for the Thunderbird came in 1958 when it went from being a two-place car to a four-place car. And sales more than doubled, and the Thunderbird became kind of an overnight sensation. It also arguably launched the so-called personal coupe craze that would continue on into the 1970s. So that 1958 bird, or the square bird, was a huge hit. It was followed by the bullet bird, as it was known, the Thunderbird that was produced from 1961 to 1963. Another gorgeous car. Perhaps my favorite Thunderbird overall would be the bullet bird. I just think it's an impeccably styled car inside and out. But when it comes to interiors, the next generation Thunderbird, the Flair bird, is really the one that I think has the best interior. And the Flair bird kind of sandwiches in between this period from the Bullet Bird that I mentioned, which was produced from 1961 to 63, and the Glamour Bird that was produced from 1967 to 1971. Now, as you take a look at this particular photo of the 1965 Thunderbird convertible that's shown here, there are so many distinct, beautiful sculptural elements of this vehicle styling. First of all, take a look at that power dome hood with that fake air intake up front. That was something that was kind of a holdover from the 1955 to 1957 Thunderbird, where, by the way, that so-called power bulge was added at the last minute because the engine underneath couldn't clear. So that was actually an afterthought that then became a signature element of Thunderbird styling, at least through these Flair bird times. By the time the Glamour bird would come around in 1967, that power bulge on the hood was really gone and was kind of integrated into the hood form overall. But notice you have this beautiful symmetry about the car. And if I had to describe something about it, I would say that this car really has that element of symmetry in numerous ways. If you look up front, you see that the hood, as well as the bumper/grille, the bumper and the grille are kind of integrated into one form there, are very symmetric. They both have that same arc, and they kind of come to a point with the same pitch and angle. And you also have the same symmetry. Imagine you drew a line across the front end of the car. It's almost a mirror image on the top and bottom of the line, and that line is effectively, imagine that's the hood cut line that just extended all the way across car. You have, again, this beautiful symmetry aside from the power dome bulge on the hood that exists between the hood as well as the lower section. Then if you look at the body side here, you notice that there's a crease that runs the entire length of the car, and there's quite a bit of symmetry above and below that crease. Notice as an example on the rear quarter panel that you have this form that kind of juts out. I guess I should say from starting at the door, there is this form that juts out on the lower portion of the door and then flows into the quarter panel and the fender skirt. And that form also forms on the upper portion of the vehicle. And they both kind of come to this beautiful end point at the rear of the car and kind of fade out almost by that point. And you can see that that area, that cove that's formed above and below that crease, is relatively symmetrical above and below the crease line. So another element of symmetry with respect to the design here. The same can arguably be said for the rear of the vehicle as well. Notice you have this immense loop bumper in the rear that encompasses the tail lamps as well as that Thunderbird logo. And imagine you continue that body side crease that you see here and had it cut through the tail lamps and the Thunderbird logo. It would pretty much be symmetric on the upper side as well as the lower side, at least the tail lights as well as the loop bumper. And you have, of course, a distinctive Thunderbird feature of this era, which is this so-called barbell theme, where the sides of the vehicle are wider than that midsection. Notice that the midsection with the Thunderbird logo is more tapered and narrower than the extremities of the car once you get above and below the tail lamps. And that was a theme that was repeated on other cars. For example, the 1966 Tornado had that barbell theme in the front. So it was just something to give a little bit more dimension and flair to the vehicle. This was, after all, the so-called Flair bird. Now, from the side profile, you don't really have symmetry with respect to the greenhouse on this car. You have the A-pillars that are very thin, and you have a super fat C-pillar. This is a Landau model with the Landau bar and the upgraded interior. I don't know how I feel about the Landau bars. Put a comment in the comment section and let me know how you feel. The Landau bar would continue on into even the 70s in the Big Bird, and it was used on the Glamour Birds, on the four-door Glamour Birds, to disguise the cut line for the rear doors. Not a huge fan of the four-door Glamour Birds, but I digress. In any case, notice how thick the C-pillar is on this, and that was really to give it an air of privacy overall, something that harkened back to the coach building days of vehicles where you had those thick C-pillars so that passersby couldn't detect who was in the rear of the car. But as I mentioned before, I think the real highlight of these 1964 to 66 Thunderbirds is the interior. And take a look at this one from a 1966 Thunderbird. I have to say, the wood grain here on the wheel, as well as the dash and the center stack, is not real, but that was because Ford was really interested in durability. In fact, the 1969 Mark III had faux wood grain. I would say a very convincing faux wood grain. It wasn't cheap stuff. And that, again, was because of durability concerns before Ford would switch in 1970 and 71 to real wood on that Mark III. But, geez, take a look at this interior and how expensive all of the different pieces are. You have real metal trim on the armrest there, at the front end of the armrest, on the center console for the vents, for the gauge faces, for the steering wheel spokes, for the radio. It just looks expensive and rich, and for those controls up in the center of the dash as well. You also have a very interesting theme where the outer section of the instrument panel has this padding that envelops the overall outer edge. Notice, for example, that the outer edge of the IP is a lighter colored red. The inner portion is a darker red. And that lighter red section is padded and soft, and the darker red is hard. So Ford really was thinking about crashworthiness as well during this time frame. They were one of the first to put safety padding on instrument panels during the prior time frame. And here you had that crash pad, and then they were thinking of safety as well as convenience. These Thunderbirds also had the swing-away wheel, such that when you got out of the car, the steering wheel would rotate out of your way and you could get in and out more easily. That was a Thunderbird feature for a number of years, and one that I think its customers really welcomed. Here's another so-called Flair bird interior, this one in black, and nothing better than black and chrome or metal and wood. It just looks fantastic. I love also the detailing of how the clock is integrated up there in the midsection, and the power window switches that are on the center console there near the armrest are placed so that if you have your arm that's resting there, you don't have to move it. You can just have your hand kind of dangle off the armrest and activate the power window switch, as opposed to leaning forward and kind of operating a power window switch that was on the door panel. I thought that was an overall nice choice. Of course, you have the various round ball gauges up there on the instrument panel as well, and those would indicate your fuel level, your coolant temperature, whether your alternator was charging or discharging, and your oil pressure. So you had all of the necessary gauges here and a kind of rotating drum style speedometer with those huge numerals. And that rotating drum would be something that Ford would use, as well as GM and Mopar on a number of vehicles. But I always thought that it was quite handsome and effective. Here's a different shot of a Thunderbird instrument panel, and I show this one because it shows the operation of the so-called swing-away wheel. Notice that it swings to the right here. Later versions would swing upward, but at this point, this one was the swing-away wheel. It swings toward the passenger compartment. I love that it also, when it swings, notice that to the left of the steering column, there's this, I guess you'll call it a vanity plate or a plate that kind of closes the gap in the instrument panel. Notice that it's also the faux wood grain so that you don't have an open hole there. I thought that was kind of cool. And you can also see those round ball gauges here, oil pressure on the left, fuel kind of one over from that, then the coolant temperature as well as the alternator charging and discharging gauge. And you can see the HVAC controls there as well as the radio on the center stack beneath the vent. So all the controls are well placed and the ergonomics are quite good, especially for a car of this time frame. Now, I couldn't have a discussion about the Thunderbird interior without discussing the wraparound rear seat. Take a look here at this wraparound rear seat in one of the Thunderbird convertibles. And notice that you get the padding kind of not only on the seat back, but on the side of the vehicle as well. And a very thickly padded armrest that I love how they kind of cut into almost the seat as it wraps around. This is something that was a hallmark of Thunderbird design for a number of years. It would also be on the Glamour Bird. The big birds, starting with the 1972 model year, would really get rid of this design. It's unfortunate because I always thought that this back seat area was something that made the Thunderbirds unique. Of course, you had the rear seat, and then you had the continuation of the center console from the front and the rear seat armrest. And of course, the rear speaker above that armrest too. Here's a picture of the rear seat in a 64 Thunderbird from a coupe. Previous one was obviously a convertible, and you'll notice that wraparound style to the rear seat. But the other thing I wanted to point out in this particular photo is those vents that are on the package shelf there. The Thunderbird was one of the earlier cars to have this flow-through ventilation system. I'll call it an extreme flow-through ventilation system. Look at how many vents there are there. There's also louvers on the rear of the car then to exhaust that in-cabin air. So as you're driving, you don't have to have the windows down. You can just have the back portion, these louvers open, and the air will kind of enter the cabin and then exit. So if you're a cigar smoker during the time frame or just a regular smoker, didn't have to worry about asphyxiating your passengers. That smoke would just come billowing out of the rear of the vehicle from the louvers that were back there. A nice feature that would continue on for a number of years and also be employed on full-size Fords and the Mark III, for an example, and also be copied, I think, to some degree by General Motors on the 1966 Tornado and Riviera. And just to show you how special the interior of those Thunderbirds and as well as the Glamour Birds was in the backseat, I thought I'd show a picture from a 1972 Thunderbird. This was the first year of the so-called Big Bird, and notice the rear seat here. It's not a bad place to be, but you've lost that real wraparound effect. I guess you have a little bit of it on the outer edges of the seat cushions, but nothing like what I just showed. So this was gone by the 1972 model year on the Thunderbirds, and it's kind of a shame because it was such a distinctive feature and one I'm sure that customers enjoyed. So what do you think of the 1964 to 66 Thunderbird, including the interiors on them? Again, I think this is one of the best interiors that Ford ever put in a car. Let me know your thoughts. Thanks again for watching.